Good morning, colleagues, and welcome to the 13th meeting in 2017 of the Finance and Constitution Committee. With apologies from Neil Bibby. As usual, can I just ask you to put your mobile phones in a mode that won't interfere with proceedings? The first item on our agenda today is to decide whether to take item 3 in private. Are members agreed? Agreed. We've agreed to take item 3 in private. Thank you. The second item on agenda is to take evidence as part of our Scottish approach to taxation. We're joined today by Judith Robertson, the Chair of the Scottish Human Rights Commission, Sandra Eden, who's a Senior Lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, and Susanna Simpson, who's the Head of Private Business at PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP. I welcome you to our evidence session this morning. We've received written submissions which have been useful from all three of you. The particular focus of this inquiry is into corporations, but there's obviously general issues that we'll want to explore as well, particularly around human rights, and I'm glad to have Judith Robertson here for that purpose. Can I just bore down, and I'm sorry to get straight into the numbers, but I found it very interesting in Sandra Eden's submission, drawing out again the figure from the OBR about a potential drop in tax revenue of £3.5 billion by 2021. As a result of incorporations, and because the number's increasing. Sandra or anybody else that wants to, it's always difficult to extrapolate from that sort of number what the impact would be for Scotland. Normally we would apply something about 10%, but I'm not sure that's applicable in these circumstances. But could you have a best go, perhaps, at explaining what that might mean for Scottish tax revenues, given that that's quite a, if it was 10%, it would be £350 million potentially.
Well, the estimated loss of tax and national insurance was just over £6 billion, and that was made up from the UK perspective by an increase in corporate tax revenue. So that's where the loss of £3 billion comes from. So you lose £6 billion, and you gain £3 billion from increased corporation tax revenues. Obviously, this plays out differently in Scotland. So I did a kind of back of an envelope calculation, but I assumed that, this could be not particular, this is real back of the envelope sort of assumptions, but I assumed that if the £6 billion loss was half tax and half national insurance contributions, and we don't know that, it's quite a difficult thing to do, but let's say it's half tax and half national insurance contributions. Obviously, Scotland isn't losing the national insurance contribution revenue, so they're only losing half of the scaled down amount of £6 billion. And so assuming that they're losing half, and assuming a sort of population relativity of 8% of the UK, I estimated that it could potentially lead to a loss of 240 million by 2021. Now, subsequent to me doing this sort of scribble at the back of the envelope, I have actually seen figures from elsewhere, I forget where at the moment, but which suggested in the region of 200 million. So it's not that far off. So those are the sorts of figures that you could potentially be looking at. Okay, it's a sizable sum, obviously, and I'm grateful for you doing that, as you describe it, back of the envelope type of work. Do you think that, have you any feeling about whether, if this committee was to ask HMRC, for instance, or the Treasury, to create an estimate for Scotland in the same way as you've done, but in obviously in a more defined way, because they've got all the numbers behind them, do you think they'd be able to do that for us? I've no idea. It would only be with a quite high degree of uncertainty. I mean, all these things are, because the incorporations are growing more slowly in Scotland than in the rest of the UK. So that would have an impact. That might reduce the numbers a little bit. I have no idea whether HMRC would be able to do that. I'm not saying. Okay. Does anybody else want to reflect on that at this stage?
Just to say, I suppose I think that reflects there are a huge number of factors involved in the decision as to whether to incorporate or not. not just tax, but also, which is obviously my area, but commercial as well. And I think that's what makes it, I would agree with you, I think it's what makes it so difficult to be able to predict the impact of this going forwards.
Okay, well obviously some of the things that might impact on it are behavioural changes and behavioural impacts, and I think Murdo wanted to pick up on that issue. So Murdo, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Good morning to you all. One of the things I think that's of interest to the committee is whether the rate of incorporation might be different in Scotland compared to the UK as a whole if it were driven by different factors, for example, differentials in terms of income tax. Now, we've seen the Scottish Government introduce a income tax differential for higher earners, which will have an impact, albeit a relatively modest impact, but an impact nonetheless. To what extent do you think differential taxation in Scotland used by the devolved government is likely to drive more people in Scotland towards incorporation compared to the rest of the United Kingdom, or is that unlikely to be a major factor? Maybe I could start with yourself, Susanna Simpson.
So I think it depends on clearly on the level of differential introduced and at what rates. So it may be with the number of 40% taxpayers in Scotland, more people will be impacted if the change was at that rate, but equally if the change was at the additional rate, it would be a higher quantum, but less taxpayers affected. So mobility is clearly the key underlying driver in terms of income tax, because taxpayers can vote with their feet and move. So it therefore depends on whether any such changes impact more numbers of taxpayers rather than those who are higher earners. I think from a behavioural perspective, the key thing to remember here is that taxpayers have more confidence and therefore let their behaviours be affected less if they know where the policy is going, why changes are introduced, how they're implemented, and ultimately the impact felt. So there's some empirical evidence as to, benefits to the economy as a result of tax changes, and therefore I think taxpayers are less likely to take behavioural decisions based on changes. That's my view.
Okay, thank you.
I looked at the OBR figures, and a point which I didn't make particularly clear in the paper, but was that there's always been primarily a NIC differential between being incorporated and not incorporated, and that has increased gradually, but not dramatically. So it's increasing a little bit faster, but it's a sort of steady move up the way, except for two particular tax-driven periods. One was the the zero rate on very small companies, and you can see an enormous spike in incorporations at that point. And then the other was a preemptive move that didn't work when they thought some more anti-avoidance rules was coming in for people who are really self-employed, but really employed but working self-employed. So you see those spikes, but those are both potentially dramatic changes. So my feeling is that the tax-driven response is unlikely to be dramatic, except at significant levels of change. Now, you're going to say, well, what's significant? I have no idea. But, 2 or 3 or 4, I don't know, what would you feel, 5% even possibly? I think those probably wouldn't be enough to stimulate people into incorporating, unless they're going to incorporate pretty much anyway.
Well, actually, to give you a very current example, I mean, there is speculation in today's papers around the reinstatement of the 50% rate for additional taxpayers. If the Scottish Government, which has the power to do this, were to increase the additional rate from 45 pence to 50 pence, do you think that would be significant? Would that drive higher earners towards incorporation?
I would need to see the evidence of the rate of tax paid by people who are in the position where you can incorporate or not. I mean, but people who are earning a lot of money might be in the position where they're in companies which they'd be in a company anyway. I don't know. Do you have any feeling about the micro, not the micro companies, but the sorts of companies that we're talking about who'd be making that decision? They may not be the additional rate taxpayers. They may be more likely to be the basic and higher rate taxpayers. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to my point that if that changes at the additional rate end, there will be less taxpayers impacted, and they may well be the owners of the larger businesses, but that's speculation. So it depends on how much that's going to play through, and they will be the more mobile ones. So,
a lot of those would probably be already be companies anyway, but I don't know that. That's a speculation.
Okay, thank you.
Marie? Oh, sorry, Ivan, did you have a supplementary on that, did you?
Yeah, I was
Sorry.
going to come in on that and just explore both of the points. I actually explore it a wee bit further. Is there we're talking as if people have got this choice. You wake up in the morning and decide to incorporate, not incorporate. But of course, it's more complicated than that, and there are rules round about that because clearly some work should be employed, and other clearly is something that requires to be done through incorporation. So I just want to explore that a wee bit further and understand your view on the rules round about that, which obviously over time have been tightened up with IR35 and other steps that are continuing to be taken to make it clearer which side of that fence you should be on. Do you think that the rules there are clear enough, or do you think the enforcement of them isn't robust enough? Because if they were clear and they were robust, we shouldn't really be having this conversation, because people really shouldn't have that choice. It should be a matter of fact whether you're incorporated or not. Now there are some grey areas, but I mean, do you want to maybe just talk round about that?
I'll take that one for starters. I think it comes back to the point that there's a number of factors in whether you incorporate or not. It's your point around what the drivers are on that event. So my clients, for instance, that are startups or scale-up businesses, so the sort of true high-growth ones driving a lot of the economy up in Scotland, will quite often take the decision to incorporate because it limits their liability. It allows them to roll up profits and invest at the beginning of that journey, which can't necessarily be achieved using non-incorporated structures. So I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that those are some very, very good reasons to incorporate, roll up a profits differential in being able to decide when to distribute and bring stakeholders in or out. I think there is a bit of work being done over the summer through the UK government. Matthew Taylor's leading a project to look at the drivers on self-employment versus employment and how that plays out into incorporations, and it'll be interesting to see the results of that, to see what drivers they believe there are non-commercial drivers, I suppose, in making that decision. But in my experience, tax is one of the factors, but it's only one of the factors taken into account, particularly on those sort of high-growth SMEs.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, I mean, my feeling is that the rules are terribly vague. You're talking about a continuum, and the borderlines on continuums are always difficult to apply. But I mean, I was just thinking that one of the things that has really sharpened up in the UK tax system recently was the definition of residence for human beings, which used to be absolutely ghastly, didn't it? It was really vague, and HMRC guidance wasn't very helpful. And the new statutory residence test is much more precise. I mean, clearly, residence is a continuum, but now it's much more precise, and the factors which have to be taken into account and how many factors you have to satisfy. Now, I haven't done the work here, but I would suspect that you could probably tighten up on that borderline. But it's a difficult thing for HMRC to do, because there are probably a lot of people on that borderline. It requires resources to keep an eye on it.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I take the point, Susanna, about if you're a start-up business, that's one thing, but I'm thinking more of the scenario which, in the kind of the back of our minds, is driving the rise in corporations, which I'm working for a company and I don't like paying tax, so I'll set up my own company and then sell my services back to this other company through my company, and that has been driven by employees doing it. It's been driven by companies persuading employees to do it, and not just at the high end, but at the bottom end as well, through the gig economy. Now, that's clearly not following the spirit of the rules, whether the legality allows it with some grey areas, and that's a very, very different thing from somebody that decides to start up a high growth business to invest in something. It's a very, very different scenario. So I'm more focused on that, because at the end of the day, the conversation we're having is round about, is that what's driving in corporations and driving this tax, $3 billion tax gap you talked about? It's not people starting up high-tech, innovative businesses. It's people that are making the shift from employment to self-employment or incorporation, but not actually changing what they're doing. And that's the area I'm kind of trying to focus down on. So what you're saying is that the rules could be clearer, and the enforcement could have more resource behind it.
I would say so. That you know, the courts are developing rules as we go along. But sometimes you're better actually taking another approach and letting the courts sort of burble on, and you know, they're doing a good job probably against a rather vague concept. But the statute could make, you know, could create a set of factors.
I agree with you in terms of certainty. I think, you know, if there is more exactly around the residence test, if there's more certainty as to how the rules apply, the grey area between what is employment and self-employment, taxpayers, it's not very easy for taxpayers to work that out themselves as to whether they're self-employed or employed. So more certainty in that area would always be a good thing.
And taxpayers can exploit uncertainty against the potentially under-resourced HMRC.
Okay, thanks.
Right, Marie?
Thank you. Can I take you back to the issue of behavioural change with regard to changes in taxation? So,
Marie, sorry, would you pull your microphone down a bit? Just, yeah.
Sorry. I'll take you back to the issue of behavioural change around changes in taxation. We discussed there that the potential for behaviour change around differences in income tax. But has there been any impact on the level of, I know it's too soon maybe to say, but would you speculate if there's likely to be any impact on the level of incorporation with the changes in, say, dividend tax, or the speculation around I know that the UK government was forced to U-turn over national insurance recently, and they're refusing to give an assurance that that won't be changed after this general election. Does that change behaviour in terms of level of incorporation and how people set up their companies?
I mean, clearly, tax being one factor in that decision, things like the changes in the dividend tax rate and the proposals, and then the withdrawal of the proposals on national insurance contributions will have decreased the strength of that factor in making that decision. But I think certainly from my client base, what we've seen developing over the last few years is less people applying the law in a way that clearly wasn't intended, and they are now in the minority. I think, you know, seeking to do that. There's been so much in the media around paying the right amount of tax, and I think, you know, the public are reacting to that. So I think the commercial factors, the world is a very, very complex place to do business now, internationally and domestically, and I think there are so many factors to get through in terms of that. Yes, tax plays a part in it, and levers such as dividend and national insurance contributions changes do have an impact, but I think they're kind of levelled out across the playing field of other commercial factors.
I wonder, though, just picking up on something that you said earlier, which was that there's clear evidence that people are more likely to try to avoid tax if there isn't clear signalling of policy and where it's going. Does that apply to this type of chopping and changing as well? I presume so.
Just to be clear, I don't think I was saying that there's more evidence that people will avoid tax. I think it's just that from a behavioural perspective, if taxpayers can see a clear objective and transparency as to how things are implemented and the impact of what they're doing, they're less likely to change their behaviours, you know, to play more part in developing the economy generally as a result of tax changes.
Okay. Anyone else have any thoughts on that?
I think the move to reduce the exemption on dividends from 5,000 to 2,000 was a sensible move. Don't really see the reason to have a full exemption. I suspect it's at the margins. at certainly £2,000, it's not that much money. It's a flat sum rather than a percentage which increases with your income increases.
Okay, thank you. The other thing I wanted to ask your thoughts on is just a very general question. So clearly income tax was never fully devolved to Scotland. It's quite limited, the control that the Scottish Government has over income tax. And it's very important, as this discussion and previous discussions in this committee have showed, that you have a balance between income tax and corporation tax, national insurance and dividend tax. How limiting do you think it is? Or, you know, do you think it's possible for the Scottish Parliament to be very radical on income tax when they don't have control over the other types of taxation as well?
Sorry, jump in. Do jump in. I think there are some significant constraints currently on the Scottish Government, exactly as you say. There is no power up here currently in relation to capital gains tax, corporation tax, inheritance tax, national insurance contributions, particularly on the decision around incorporation point. All of those taxes play a part in that, and therefore to have no power and control over that makes it very difficult in taking decisions on the income tax side of things. I think all governments are subject to those constraints. The UK government's equally subject to those constraints in relation to EU law and things like VAT, which may well change going forwards, clearly. So, yeah, I think there's certainly a limitation on the ability to make significant changes.
Yes, I suppose with the rates, it's a fairly blunt instrument, isn't it? All you can do is increase or decrease the amount of tax. You can't take countermeasures. So, for example, with the issue of incorporation, you know, income tax is one of the factors, but there's also NICs and corporation tax rates, which are, well, and CGT, IHT as well. These are factors which you don't control. So yeah, I mean, it is a limited tool, yeah. And you take the risk. I think the point is that you bear the risk, and there's very few other levers that you have that you can mitigate the risk.
Thank you.
Liam, you wanted to some questions in that area, and then we'll come to Patrick and advantages and disadvantages.
Yes, please. Thank you, Convener. Good morning. At the outset, the question for Susanna Simpson, please, arising from something that Ivan McKee said. I have a concern that the debate becomes laden with value judgments about incorporation, that incorporation is avoidance of tax, and tax avoidance somehow cheats the public purse and is immoral. Your paper is quite clear that actually the ultimate choice of commercial structure is primarily made in the light of commercial and family considerations, with tax as a secondary consideration. Now, my experience says that that's right, and I suspect your experience says that's right, but what I'm concerned with is there objective data that says that that's right, or is this simply an experience from PwC?
I must admit it's my experience. We don't have and haven't carried out any research in this area, so I can't give you any empirical data. It may well exist out there, but not that I'm aware of.
Are you aware of whether anyone else is carrying out that analysis? Because some of the evidence that we've seen previously would contradict that assessment and suggest that everyone's incorporating to avoid tax. You obviously take a different view. I would agree with that different view, but that is an experiential thing. Is there any evidence out there? Is anyone going to take any evidence on that to prove the point?
Sandra,
well, I mean, the spikes in the OBR figures, the figures are from Companies House. It's extraordinarily difficult to get historic figures from Companies House, actually. But the OBR figures show these spikes, which must be related to two tax matters, the spikes in 2002, 2004, and then again in 2006. Dramatic increase in the number of incorporations that were related to the zero rate of tax on micro companies and a predicted change to the managed service companies, and they were trying to incorporate before that change came in the hope that they would be excluded from the change. So my point is, I think, is that there is, where there is significant differences, there is a tax, a purely tax-driven behavioural response. And I think that the spikes in corporations, which are specifically related to tax changes, can be, there is evidence of that. But in where the differentials are smaller, then I don't think that's true.
Moving on to just Sandra Eden, a number of submissions have analysed how a reduction in tax or the impact of incorporation on a reduction in tax. So I think you said earlier there was a loss of, say, 6 billion, but an increase or a recoupment of 3 billion through a different tax, give or take. Are you aware, has there been any other analysis of other spin-off impacts? So just for example, if I incorporate, I will use a local law firm to do it, I'll use a local accountant, I'll use local suppliers, I'll rent a premises. So there is, if you like, an indirect benefit to the local economy, none of which would have happened if I was an employee. But presumably, if we, my point being, if we take a very blunt analysis of tax take, is there evidence of what else is going on?
The knock-on advantages.
Correct.
I am not aware of any. No, sorry.
Right. Do you think someone ought to be doing that exercise so that the other side of the coin almost is, we're aware of that?
Yeah. I think it's hard. It would be a very difficult piece of research to do, to get good figures that would be valid over a period of years, I suspect. But should they? I don't know whether this is a piece of information that you know, obviously one would like to have loads more information about this. You need to have a much greater degree of certainty of the impact of the things that you're talking about doing.
I think that's absolutely right. In a perfect world, we would have all of that information available for us because it goes to that certainty point, so you know the impact of the changes that you're making. It's whether that information is available.
I just think it probably ought to be available, because if we've been asked to make a decision based on tax take, that does give one side of the coin and doesn't say, look, there's actually some positive impact potentially. I've one final question, again on data and analysis. Is there any analysis that you're aware of on how many economically inactive people become economically active through the incorporation model who wouldn't otherwise through being employed?
I'm not aware of any data on that. We have done some research, and I haven't got the numbers in front of me, but we've done some research on the impact of the gig economy, which is something that's driving that. So where you have, for instance, people coming back into work and working from home and choosing more likely to be self-employed to start off with part-time workers. That is, you know, that's changing, and there's a lot more of that than there was in the past. So they are more likely to be self-employed than moving into employment, but I don't have the data to prove that.
From what you can recall, does that sounds like anecdotal evidence, but does that tend to suggest that people are making a rational choice to choose that model to re-enter the market, or are they doing it based on your data because they're forced to, or they have no other choice?
I think it's probably a combination of the two, because being self-employed when you are moving back into the market is likely to be a more flexible manner of operating than immediately going back into employment and being required to work full-time or almost full-time. So I think it just, and this is my experience from speaking to clients rather than based on anything empirical, but it is that sort of step back into the workplace is more likely to happen through self-employment rather than employment.
Thank you.
Okay. Patrick.
Thanks very much. It does seem to me, not just from the last few minutes of discussion, but also from some of the evidence we heard last week, that there's a case for more research on a range of the aspects of this issue, particularly this kind of slightly grey area between what's being called the gig economy and what's often described as bogus self-employment, where you've actually got someone in an employment relationship, but they are only given the option of having that through some form of self-employment and losing all of the consequent rights and protections that would come with employment, which I think many people would say give real flexibility. I was looking at the list of advantages and disadvantages of incorporation in Susanna Simpson's written submission, and it occurs to me that this is where we should be focused if we want to actually engage in some kind of meaningful attempt to make a difference in what's happening. Now, it may be that the government of any day doesn't wish to deliberately try and intervene in that way, but if there was an assumption that we have government policy which recognises there is, to some extent, a tax avoidance element in incorporation, or that that's one part of the motivation in some circumstances, is there anything that, first of all, the Scottish Government in a devolved context can do, or secondly, that the UK Government in a reserved context ought to be doing to alter the balance between the advantages and disadvantages in order to achieve its desired effect of supporting incorporation where there is genuine benefit to society and the economy, but disincentivising it where it's closer to that grey area around bogus self-employment? Can we intervene in the balance of those advantages and disadvantages to that effect?
I assume that's a question to me initially. Yeah, to jump in, I think I agree that's a very good place to start to focus those advantages and disadvantages. And you'll note on the disadvantages list, PAYE, so the sort of tax factor in that is only one of the number of disadvantages in there. I think it comes back to the number of levers available to the Scottish Government as devolution stands currently, given that there is only the lever over income tax rates currently, and everything around capital gains tax, corporation tax, dividend tax rates is currently out with control. So there is a limit to the amount that the Scottish Government at the moment can impact this. A lot of these are around legal limitations, and obviously from a corporate perspective, Scots law and the legal system south of the border are very similar around incorporation. So there is probably more that could be done to change those sort of underlying legal factors, but that is a sort of a much bigger decision or question to take on, I think.
One option, for example, might be for the Scottish Government to have either some restriction or some code which sets out in what circumstances people can access devolved taxpayer-funded business support services, grant and loan schemes, public procurement opportunities, or in fact the ability or the willingness of public bodies and agencies to employ people in certain structures or other structures that they would generally avoid. To what extent would that be a useful tool in giving a clear signal to the rest of the economy, here's what's on and here's what's not on?
I think, going back to clarity, if that is set out as a clear objective within legislation or guidance, then the taxpayers at least are aware of the intention behind the legislation, but I can't give you a view on whether that's the correct policy or not. That's outside my remit.
Not necessarily a correct policy, I wouldn't expect you to comment on that, but a policy with the potential to have an effect.
Again, I think if there's a transparency of objective around something that's being done, then it increases clarity for the public.
Do the other witnesses want to comment on these issues?
I will in a minute, yeah. But I'll put it in the context of my other remarks.
I think one of the main guilty parties here is actually national insurance, which obviously is outside your remit, and it is no longer the case that the huge difference between employer and employee NICs is justified by the differential in benefit entitlement. There used to be some sort of link at one level. And I think national insurance contributions actually have to be looked at across the board, all scrapped. Or, this is something that rumbles on. The problem is, of course, that politically it seems to be a bit easier. Well, actually, no, the recent evidence suggests otherwise. Of course, it is a bit easier to get money through national insurance contributions than tax, but the last few months suggest that that's no longer the case. Do as we do, I suppose, in terms of encouraging people who have that employment relationship to have an employment contract.
Recent events around national insurance, for me, sort of slightly underline an argument that was put at a previous session in this inquiry, which is that company law, as it stands at the moment, isn't up to meeting the requirements of the modern economy, and that what's required is a more fundamental rewrite, perhaps, you know, more kind of points along the spectrum between employment and incorporation, or closing the gap in tax paid by people in different structures. Is a fundamental
Certainly the latter, yeah.
Is a fundamental rewrite in company law required?
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay.
I'm not a commercial lawyer.
I was going to come on to the human rights issues. Do you want others to come in first, or?
We're finished all the incorporation stuff, and I know I want to make sure that Judith gets a chance to reflect on her paper. Has anybody got any other corporation questions at this stage? Well, we haven't, and I know Susanna, you've got to be away for I think 10:30. So, if we're still in evidence session and you're still here, you need to go. Please, just feel free to make your exit at that time. We'll just start somebody else off in the human rights thing, just so we can let you back in. But Willie, you want to kick us off?
Oh, thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, panel. I was hoping to bring Judith in to focus on the discussion in terms of human rights. Your paper at the outset, Judith, said taxation is a crucial contributing component of the realisation of human rights. And while that might not be so immediately obvious to many people out there, your paper makes clear that it's fundamentally at the heart of fairness in society. You also talk about the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and impacts on women. My question to you is, how do we assess these impacts more directly to illustrate the impacts that taxation changes may actually have? Data tends to be in the hands of governments and agencies and so on, but in terms of your own agency, how do you reach out and analyse and present to MSPs or to the wider public about the wider impacts that changes in taxation policy can have with respect to human rights?
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to talk on this issue. I think in direct answer to your question, there are a number of tools that are available and at your disposal in order to do a human rights impact assessment of policy. It is actually currently a requirement of equalities legislation that an equalities impact assessment is done in advance of a decision being made on policy. And the kinds of impacts that you've just been talking about in relation to incorporation, for example, give some lines into assessing both in terms of revenue, the return on the decision, on the impact of a decision, and the drivers of change within a decision, within a process. Those are some of the potential human rights assessments that we can make. And the reason we are talking about coming at this from a human rights perspective is that it provides both a framework that people can begin to understand. So again, in the principles of certainty that people were talking about, transparency, having a conversation with the public, an understanding from a public perspective of why we're doing what we're doing. I think the human rights framework gives us a framework in which to do that. And clearly, it's underpinned by international law. So it's not just something that's good to have, it's something that is actually been something that, as a UK, as a state party, the UK has signed up to, the Scottish Parliament and public authorities in Scotland are committed to through the Scotland Act. So there is a kind of legal framework that that provides the basis and the underpinning of taking a human rights perspective, indeed to any policy. But in this instance, you were asking about the Scottish approach to taxation from a principled perspective. As I say, enshrined in law, it gives the Scottish Parliament a really strong basis on which to be looking and assessing decisions that they make in relation to taxation. And and those decisions, coming from a range of international treaties, provide a framework for having that conversation with the public.
See, when you look across the landscape in different jurisdictions, can you see any evidence or data from other jurisdictions that show that their particular government, for example, has introduced a measure which has a certain impact in society? Is that clear to us? Could we pick that kind of information up in order to help guide us in our decision making in the years to come?
There are examples from across the world. In fact, the South African Constitution has brought economic, social, cultural rights at heart and centre to its constitutional framework. Within that setting, government, public authorities, decision makers have to take into account their impact on economic, social, cultural rights as well as civil, political rights into their thinking when they're making decisions. Back home in Scotland, the Minister, Jean Freeman, has committed to bring the right to social security into the heart of policy making in Scotland today. That will have an impact on the way that policy is delivered in terms of communicating to people what their rights are in relation to social security in Scotland, the way the system is designed, the processes that have been gone through to design that system, and to actually establish that as it is already people's right. They already have a right to social security, but enshrining it in law, in domestic law, strengthens it domestically.
And what about infringements, should they occur, or alleged infringements of people's human rights in relation to things like taxation or fiscal policy or whatever? Where do people go for redress? Do we disappear down the legal route to the European Court of Human Rights and so on? Do we go in there? And is it very difficult to achieve any kind of redress if people feel, or there are judgments in fact made about human rights issues in relation to these matters?
We can keep it general or make it more specific to taxation explicitly at a level. That's up to you. But one of the fundamental principles of a rights-based approach is bringing in effective accountability, effective redress, and ensuring that within the system that the Scottish Government and Parliament decide to establish, that the systems of redress are explicit, it's clear how they can be accessed, they are resourced and funded, there's effective monitoring, and that there's a really a transparent process by which people can access justice. Now, in the context of taxation, you would be making an assessment of, from the principles would say we're coming from an issue of, we're looking at resource take, so we're looking at the resources that we're actually seeking to generate. We're looking at what we want to spend those resources on. So how fair is that expenditure process, and then how transparent, how accountable and transparent are we making the systems by which people can understand what's happening. So people have talked here about certainty, about rationale, about transparency, can understand what it is that they're being asked to contribute to, and crucially why. And then there's a clear system whereby they can make appeal. That system is affordable, accessible, and people are aware of it. They can access effectively their rights. So there's I'm not being very specific, as in here's a specific system. What I'm saying is there are principles that, in any aspect of government policy, you can work from. And a level, given that you have established a national human rights institution as a country, we're signed up to constitutionally to endorse our international treaties that the UK as a state has signed up to. We have an obligation to bring these matters into the way we do business in Scotland.
And lastly, where will we stand, do you think, with all of this, if the UK does scrap the Human Rights Act? It's perhaps not so clear at the moment, but that was their stated intention recently. And in fact, the Prime Minister said we should withdraw for the European Convention on Human Rights, saying that it adds nothing to the prosperity of the country. I mean, how are we going to judge or measure any of this if we move away from that Human Rights Act altogether?
Our human rights protections will be severely weakened if that happens, clearly. There will be very little backstop, very little basis on which those kind of principles and decisions, which internationally we have signed up to. I mean, I can't emphasise that enough. These are not commitments that we have come by lightly. They were negotiated internationally. We were part of those negotiations, and in many contexts actually setting the terms of the debate. And that was a political process internationally that the UK is committed to. So no, I mean the protections that are provided by the Convention and by the Human Rights Act are strong, they're important, and in fact from the perspective of the Human Rights Commission and indeed many other national human rights institutions, they should be strengthened, not weakened. We are not fully protected in relation to international human rights standards. We do not have in the UK those protections, and any attempt to weaken them should be resisted and you know, step back from. And in any setting where that might happen, then public authorities in Scotland, including the Parliament and the Government, has a duty to ensure that it does everything within its power to put in place those protections that it can, and that would be a recommendation from the Human Rights Commission as well, Scottish Human Rights Commission as well.
Thank you.
Now, I know there's a couple of James, I think you were interested in transparency issues, and that's been mentioned a couple of times, so I'll bring you as a first supplementary and then Adam.
Okay, thanks a lot, Convener. I was interested in the points you made and also the points in your submission about transparency and public participation. Obviously, the decisions made around taxation have a big impact. You know, they have an impact on families and individuals in terms of how much taxation they pay, and therefore impact on their household income, and also the impact on the level of budgets, and therefore how much, you know, we're able to invest and spend on communities. But a lot of the discussion around this, a bit like we've had this morning, can be quite technical. So I think there's a big issue about people on the ground being able to interact with that. So what do you think can be done to make, in terms of more transparency, what can be done to make more information available in a more understandable format so that people can participate with the decisions around taxation and how they will impact on their lives?
I think that's an answer we probably could all have a view on. I think from a human rights perspective, again, we have a duty to provide information in a way that is accessible to all people in our society. It doesn't discriminate and indeed supports people's access to that information. So doing that, both in terms of participating in decision making, actually contributing to the thinking and the analysis and why decisions might be made. We have a responsibility to do that. There's many things we can do in terms of engaging all sorts of NGOs, community organisations in the conversation around the principles, both the principles of our, whether it be our tax system or indeed any other system of policy, revenue system, and both the whys, the principles and underpinning, and then what the money is going to be spent on, because that's what enables citizens to sign up. Where internationally, where government revenue is raised by a system of taxation, the population's investment in the government processes is far more increased than if, for example, the finances is coming directly through natural resource revenue or some other means. And so that dynamic of a citizen's contract with the state and an investment in the state as an effective delivery vehicle, that for me is not for me, but from a human rights perspective, is a fundamental dynamic and so that those processes of engagement, those processes of participation, they're crucial. And mean, I can describe some specific. There are very good ways internationally and domestically, and in England, and indeed, to be honest, the Scottish, through the community empowerment legislation, where actually budget has been allocated to a participatory budgeting process, where you've put, you've made decisions that we are actually going to empower communities to participate in ways of spending that budget. That, for me, is a very good example of enabling that participation. Now, how we monitor that participation, how we monitor the quality of that participation and the effectiveness of it and the degree of participation, these are all resource issues and implications that have to be dealt with within decision making. But there's myriad examples of good practice, in fact, and any NGO who's working with people who are vulnerable, whose issues in relation to receiving information, understanding it, communicating it, will have plenty of really good practice to communicate difficult concepts, but they're not that difficult. People understand making a contribution and getting something back from that contribution. That's not fundamentally a difficult concept. We make it very, very complicated, actually. We really make it complicated. Now, apparently our tax book is massive. That maybe one of the principles, one of the lessons of the principles of a human rights approach is actually simplifying the process so that people can fundamentally understand it, and indeed we can fundamentally understand and predict outcomes of decisions much more easily because the complexity is reduced.
Susanna, sure you want to contribute to this as well?
Well, I mean, just one thing in support of something Judith said is there is evidence to show that the greater degree of sort of trust, using the word loosely, in your government is directly correlated with voluntary tax compliance. So the more the people believe you're doing a good job and that you're spending the money properly, the more likely you are to get people kind of paying tax without the arm up the back. The other thing that might be thought about, it's something that's very visible. The economists don't like it, but these are hypothecated taxes where you raise a particular amount of money and you commit that to a particular budget. You know, the Lib Dems have talked about that. Now, the economists say that these are bad things because you should be spending the money where you should best spend the money, rather than actually committing yourself in advance to spend a particular portion of money in a particular way. But if you're talking about visibility and an easy way of people understanding where their tax is going, you could say an extra penny is going to go into, you know, cat and dog home or something. As I say, they're not generally regarded by the economists as particularly good taxes, but economists don't know everything.
I'd agree entirely with that, and particularly coming on to the hypothecated taxes. I think we've got a great opportunity in Scotland, starting from scratch without a huge bulk of legislation behind us as we move forward. We've already set out the Scottish Government principles around taxation. I think that's really helpful, and just being very simple, exactly as Judith has said, as around those principles drives behavioural movements from the people impacted by it. And I think also going into the hypothecated taxes, I agree, ring fencing the receipts that are coming out of those taxes, things like the soft drinks levy, we've kind of gone down that route, and proposals in that regard makes it very, very clear as to where the government policy is going, and therefore has the intended effects in terms of behaviours.
Thanks. Adam, you have a supplementary from Ellers.
Yeah, thank you. This is just arising out of the exchange a few moments ago between Judith Robertson and Willie Coffey. Judith, you answered Willie's question about enforcement in a way that you yourself described as rather generic. And I just want to drill down into a bit more of the detail of that, because human rights law isn't generic about the enforcement of human rights, is it? It's quite specific and quite particular in the sense that effective judicial protection of human rights is itself a human right. That's been the case in the jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice for decades, and it's of course what we see in Article 13 of the European Convention. You'd agree with that, I assume? Yes. Would it therefore be your position that any putative human rights approach to either taxation or to social security, which you mentioned earlier, would have to include a right to effective judicial protection for it really to be a human rights approach?
Ultimately, Yes, absolutely. However, well, there's a number of things you can say. I would say, yes, a judicial approach gives the final backstop of protection. It's the last, for many respects, it's the last place you would want people to end up. Ultimately, one of the intentions of human rights approach is to influence and affect all policy, so that it isn't just about a judicial backstop, it's about a process which enables a consideration and a reflection and a review. And so policy, one of the things that the impact, for example, internationally is reckoned of full incorporation of the Convention of the Rights of the Child. So full incorporation basically meaning it's enshrined in domestic law, which currently is not the case in Scotland or the UK for this Convention of the Rights of the Child, is that it impacts all of policy. So it isn't just the judicial backstop that is fundamental, but it's the process up front which changes the way policy is made and changes what policies are put in place. And so potentially the threat of a judicial backstop is one of the things that drives that change. Now that's a legitimate process. But I suppose one of the reasons that fundamental piece was put in place was because of the reason that human rights law was put in place in the first place, was there was a recognition that states could abuse their power to the vast detriment of their populations. And so putting in place a protection which gave a citizen the fundamental right to hold their state to account via a judicial process was a really important principle of human rights law. And so for me, seeing that ability, now it's, you know, that's the last recourse that we would be looking for. But having it in place is powerful. It sends a powerful message to the citizen that actually we're going to be held responsible for our actions.
Not merely is it powerful, it's essential if you are serious about having a human rights-based approach to either taxation or social security. Yeah. Yes, thank you.
Susanna, I'm conscious of the time. 26 minutes past. Do you want to make it at this stage and that make it easier for you before we get into the next set of questions?
Thank you.
I'll go Ash, then I'll come to Patrick. Ash.
This is a question for Judith Robertson as well. So in the submission that you put in, it says that a state should take strong measures to combat tax abuse, and if they don't, then they're not fully realising, you know, economic, social and cultural rights and so on. And then a quote from the submission was that tax abuse is not a victimless crime. So if we're saying that the tax gap in the UK is estimated, the most recent one I could find was from 2014, and it was £120 billion a year. Obviously, most of the powers over enforcing that are held at the UK government level, but clearly that does have an effect on Scottish government public finances. Therefore, do you see a link then between the UK government's failure to close that tax gap and Scottish human rights?
Now you come to mention it. Well, I suppose it's again, coming back to the principle, one of the principles, the human rights principle of transparency and accountability. That gap where there's an expectation that the revenue would be generated and the revenue isn't generated means that it's harder for any government, including the Scottish Government, to put in place policies, health, social care, education, to support policies which actually deliver people's rights on the ground. Ultimately, that's where we want to get to. That's what the Human Rights Framework is intended to do, and it potentially removes resources. Now that's a global phenomenon. I have to say, it's not in defence of the UK government. Clearly, the UK government is in fact one of the international drivers of some of those processes of enabling tax avoidance. But domestically, it removes potential revenue from public authorities to spend, absolutely, and therefore limits the capacity of those authorities to deliver people's rights. There is a direct correlation, absolutely. And in a Scottish context, if we're taking an approach to taxation here, ensuring that that tax is paid, is monitored, is adequately collected, and then being held to account for that expenditure is an integral part of the process. Yes.
guess that there's a bit of a dichotomy developing there then between if Scotland takes a different approach on tax, more of a rights-based approach, for instance, and then the UK government, you know, is, I mean, if you just use the tax gap as one example, is maybe taking a different approach on that. And, you know, we know about the secrecy jurisdictions in London and so on. So you've got two differing approaches. Is it possible for them to work and be compatible within one island?
Yes, I would say that's absolutely possible. It's not without its challenges, but you're going to have to make as a parliament and government, you'll have to make a choice about what you're having this conversation about. Is there a Scottish approach to taxation? Ultimately, there will be a Scottish approach, no matter what that is, and you will make a decision about that process. From my perspective, the Scottish Government and Parliament can make a decision which is advancing people's rights, being progressive, making that, as they call it under economic social culture rights, progressive realisation possible, or has the potential to do something which goes the other direction. Now, clearly, that's a political decision, but clearly we're advocating that we go in a progressive direction, and yeah, it's possible to be different.
Thank you.
You've achieved that in many other areas of policy. I see no reason why you can't do it in taxation.
Patrick, I'm coming to you now. Sorry I didn't bring it a bit earlier on this. I'm trying to make sure I was getting everybody else in the room involved in the conversation as well, because I know you'd signalled up an interest in this area. So.
No, that's fine. The enforcement angle I'd like to pick up on first of all. Just help me to understand the extent to which citizens can take action against government on human rights grounds in relation to fiscal decisions at the moment, because they've clearly had some success in doing that on welfare issues. For example, when people were effectively required to work without pay under threat of sanctions, a series of successful court cases were taken against the UK government on that. If that level of human rights argument can be brought to a court in relation to welfare, is it not possible today to bring that level of human rights argument to a court in relation to a government decision about taxation?
To be honest, I can't fully answer your question, Patrick, to be honest. I mean, it's a good question, and I can go away and do a bit of research and come maybe back to you with a specific answer. In principle, I actually agree with you. I don't think there is any reason why somebody couldn't. It might be quite an indirect route. It might be quite hard to argue. It might be easier in an instance of a hypothecated tax, where you're making a direct correlation between what the money raised is being spent on. So you're looking for a human rights impact. There may be instances where in relation to the right to property, the right to ownership, where some of those arguments about property rights have been used to I don't know if they've actually been used to challenge a taxation decision. So there may be instances, both domestically or internationally, where that has been done. I'm not aware of the direct ones.
I'm not aware of attempts within the UK to do that either, which is why I was asking whether it's possible. I think Sandra.
Well, I mean, there have been cases on both on property and on the right to human life. In fact, one of the UK cases went to the Grand Chamber. It was two sisters who were trying to claim an inheritance tax relief when one of the elderly sisters died, because they couldn't marry, so they couldn't. The answer is that it has been a relatively weak tool, challenges to the court, because of the large margin of appreciation that the court has given to national jurisdictions to impose tax. So very long delays or retrospective taxation, quite unusual types of things have been successful, but on the whole, you can design your own tax system.
And in trying to move to a stronger situation in respect to the ability of citizens to exercise these rights and challenge government decisions on tax, is part of the complexity the fact that we have tax decisions taken by the UK government, the Scottish government and local government. So, for example, a person who argued that their cumulative tax burden, including things like council tax, which is set at a local level, that their cumulative tax burden was higher than somebody who was much wealthier, and that tax burden overall was what was depriving them of the ability to exercise their human rights or to access their human rights. To whom would they bring that challenge?
At the moment, well, I mean, they could take the cumulative tax burden would be within. Well, at the moment, you might want to do that under equalities legislation, whether or not actually they were being discriminated against because of the cumulative impact of a piece of policy, whether that be taxation or welfare reform, whatever. And that's something that's been advocated for by the Equality and Human Rights Commission in relation to really understanding the impact of policies to do that cumulative impact assessment. At the moment, because under the Human Rights Act, for example, it's principally civil and political rights that are protected explicitly. There is limited protection. It's quite around economic, social, cultural rights. So we're advocating that the Scottish Government, Parliament, and indeed the UK Government incorporates those rights in order that those questions can more adequately be explored.
Scottish ministers are unable to take actions that breach people's human rights. It's not just that this Parliament can't pass legislation that does so. Ministers can't act except in compliance with human rights. That's not true, as far as I understand it, of UK ministers' actions. I don't know whether it's true of local councils in making their tax decisions.
It is, yeah. It's true of UK ministers too. Sorry. Neither UK ministers nor local authorities in England, Wales or any other part of the United Kingdom are lawfully able to breach people's human rights under Section 6 of the Human Rights Act.
Thank you. I'm grateful to the witness.
Excuse me.
I mean, I'm trying to get a sense of where the challenge would be directed if the tax decisions which are affecting a person's human rights are the result of more than one level of government.
I'm not a lawyer. Forgive me. We can get this with the lawyers, but I'm not. I don't actually think the route is if we're going through a court process, the decision maker is the end is the one that is impacted wherever the decision is made. I think that would have to be through the Scottish National Court process.
I just wanted to ask as well about the basic principles and to see if I understand the general thrust of your paper. The principles which the Scottish Government proposes for taxation policy are largely about the direct fiscal impacts, proportionate to the ability to pay, certainty to the taxpayer, convenience, ease of payment and efficiency. Those are about the individual taxpayer and how they're directly affected by tax policy. It seems to me that you are arguing three things about these basic principles, and you know, I'd be grateful for your view on whether I understand this right. It seems to me you're firstly arguing that there should be a principle of sufficiency, that tax policy must be sufficient to raise revenue that meets public need in respect of providing people's human rights and ensuring that those are not breached. Secondly, that indirect effects of tax policy on people's human rights should be included as a principle, that the effects of tax policy need to be compliant, not just the operation of it. And thirdly, that there should be a principle of accountability. Is that broadly correct? Are you asking that the Scottish Government should specify those in its principles of tax policy?
Broadly, that is correct. The Article 2 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights effectively demands that each state party undertakes steps individually and through international assistance and cooperation, especially economic and technical, to the maximum of its available resources. So that's to the that's to seek to maximise those available resources as well. So in order to achieve people's economic, social, cultural rights, that's just within one one treaty. There are many treaties where reference to that process of actually raising the revenue to do the work that the treaty demands are highlighted and made public, that we have signed up to. So yes, we have an absolute commitment and duty to deliver against those recommendations. To progressively achieve the full realisations of rights recognised in the Covenant. And so that for me is the fundamental underlining principle of any tax system, that we're seeking to actually to achieve that. So making those transparent and accountable connections between the revenue being raised, what the money is being spent on, what we're seeking to achieve by that money. Taxation is a means to an end. It isn't an end in itself. And enabling people to better understand the end achieves more that investment in contributing to it. We have, in my view, this is not, we have a pretty toxic relationship with taxation in the public narrative in the UK. In other countries around the world, the relationship to taxation is valued very differently. It's valued as seen as something that people are proud of contributing to, seen as something that people value. They're very open about it. I believe in some of the Scandinavian countries, entire tax contribution is published, is made public. We have a very closed attitude and relationship to this issue. We have the opportunity to change that, I think, in Scotland. And one of the ways to do that is to be transparent and accountable and explicit as to our intention. The principles that you've outlined are good, but in my view not sufficient in order to achieve what I've just described. And I think we have an opportunity to achieve that, and bringing a rights-based approach to doing that, it doesn't, we have a duty to do that. That's a key issue, clearly, but it also provides a legitimate framework within which we can start to communicate to citizens about these issues much more clearly. And if we took all of government policy within that framework, or all of it which is relevant within that framework, which is frankly most of it, then all of that conversation would start to resonate and have a different kind of meaning for people. And they could, that relationship between taxation and expenditure would be a different kind of conversation.
Some of this relates to Sandra Eden's earlier comments that there is research demonstrating a link between the level of trust in government and voluntary tax compliance. I would find it valuable to get a reference to that research if it's available.
There appears to be a correlation. I'm not saying that is necessarily a causative correlation, but there is a correlation.
It would be really interesting to see the reference to that research.
It was old EU stuff. I can dig that out.
That'd be really helpful. Thank you.
Pre the enlargement.
I've got a couple of quick supplementary things. Murdo?
Yes, thank you. It was a follow-up to Patrick's first line of questioning around taxation and human rights. And I'm wondering, is there ever any level of taxation that would be deemed to be a breach of human rights? So, for example, if the government set a confiscatory rate of tax, say 98%, or even 100%, do you think that could be challenged under human rights as, for example, a breach of the right to property?
I think it probably could be challenged. Whether or not it would survive the challenge depending on the rationale for doing that, so based on the rationale for doing that, that might be something to do with how that money was generated, and so there could be extenuating circumstances. I suppose what human rights law gives you is the opportunity to have that conversation, to have that debate, and to see, is that proportionate? Is it contributing to the progressive realisation? Is it justifiable from a rights perspective? Now, clearly, under this conversation, I can't make that assessment. But yeah, I mean, it gives you that space to really look at the balance of rights and the reasons, the rationale for those decisions being made, and to have that conversation up front. So before you make that decision, is that a good? Is it justifiable in human rights terms to take that action in this setting for that reason?
Okay, thank you.
Marie?
Just a very quick supplementary, and it's slightly off topic, but I was very interested when you were discussing the possibility of whether a government, the UK government, could act against individuals' human rights. And I was immediately thinking of the welfare reform, the bedroom tax, where the UN declared that that was a systematic violation of the rights of disabled people. And I know it was challenged in the High Court, and is it being appealed in the Supreme Court, or has that process worked right the way through yet? Or because many people do consider that to have been a breach of the rights of disabled people, and yet it is still currently policy, isn't it? It is still currently policy, and at the moment no changes to policy, that policy have been made on the basis of either the intervention from the UN or, as I'm far away, from the court. Yeah. Against people's human rights. Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Technically, it's not a tax. Really.
No, it's not a tax. I know. No, clearly, it's not a tax, called. So I know. That's why I said it's slightly off topic. I know it's called the bedroom tax, but it was actually welfare reform. Yeah.
Leo.
Thank you.
Leo.
Quick link back to incorporation, if I may. You've talked at some length about the transparency in how we spend tax, and that people should understand that. Can we extrapolate from that? Ought there not to be similar transparency in how we raise tax from people, and from that to ensure that everyone can make an informed and unfettered choice about what vehicle is most appropriate for their circumstances, whether it be employment, self-employment or incorporation?
Absolutely. To be honest, I mean, I would absolutely say that that transparency in all those processes. I mean, I'm clearly not a tax expert, but listening to that conversation, one of the things that really struck me was the lack of certainty, and that in a context where there's lots of grey areas, then that does not enhance transparency or accountability. It makes it really difficult to either challenge either an individual for their decision or an organisation for their decision, because there's lots of uncertainty. And yeah, I would say that transparency, it really doesn't matter where you are in the system. Being able to make it very clear, explicit and transparent is a key principle.
Well, I mean, I think the prior thing is that you should be actually looking at how you tax these people and be taxing them in similar ways. Similar people should be taxed similarly, you know, horizontal equity.
Sorry, that whole principle of equality and non-discrimination in a process would also apply to the structure of the taxation system. Now, the recommendation from many international UN experts are that progressive taxation systems are more likely to lead to human rights outcomes because you're taking less from those who have less. In fact, they're not more likely to. They will lead to better human rights outcomes because those who can afford to contribute more are contributing more, and those who can afford to contribute less actually do contribute less. So the cumulative impact that Patrick described, or was referring to, of a tax burden, whether that be through indirect taxes such as VAT or direct taxation, is a really important outcome. It's a really important indicator of actually having a direct human rights impact.
I mean, the UK tax system overall is mildly regressive when you take into account consumption taxes. If you look at the top 20% and the bottom 20%, it's mildly regressive in total.
Probably now got to the natural end of that particular evidence session we've had this morning with the witnesses. Can I thank very much the witnesses for coming along this morning and contributing to our deliberations. At the start of the meeting, we agreed to take the next item in private. I therefore now close this public part of the meeting. Thank you very much.